he walked out of a $60 million meeting. Not because the numbers were wrong. The numbers were perfect. He'd built them himself, layer by layer, at 4:45 in the morning for 3 weeks straight, on 4 hours of sleep, on bad coffee, on the specific terror of a man who cannot afford to fail. He walked out because his phone rang, and in the 30 seconds it took him to decide, the entire floor went silent. Keyboards stopped. Chairs stopped. 34 people stopped breathing while the woman who had dismantled companies across 4 states stood in the boardroom doorway and waited for him to choose. He chose. The elevator doors closed behind him. Nobody moved. And then the woman who had fired a man for missing 2 days of work picked up her jacket, her keys, and followed him. Nobody in that building had ever seen her follow anyone. The alarm didn't buzz, it rattled. A cheap plastic thing from a pharmacy on Rainier Avenue, bought 3 years ago during a week, when Ryan Robinson had exactly $11 left in his checking account and needed something that would wake him before the world started demanding things from him. Every morning at 4:45 a.m. It sounded like a dying insect trapped inside a tin can. Every morning he slammed his palm down on it before it could wake Emma. She needed the sleep more than he did. That was the calculation he made every single day without thinking about it. Her sleep mattered more. His knuckles ached from the impact. His lower back ached from the couch. He lay there in the dark of the living room, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since before he moved in. A brown, irregular shape that he had, over 3 years of sleepless early mornings, come to think of as a map of somewhere he'd never been. He was 32 years old. He was running on 4 hours of sleep. He was entirely responsible for keeping another human being alive, functional, and pointed in the direction of something better than what he'd managed for himself. Her name was Emma. She was 19. She was sleeping in the only bedroom of their 2-room apartment in South Seattle, with her door pulled halfway shut, the way she'd slept since she was small, because she said a fully closed door felt like being buried. He'd remembered that. He'd always remembered that. He rolled off the couch. The hardwood floor hit his bare feet like a cold correction. He stood there a second, adjusting, the way a man adjusts when his body reminds him of everything he's been asking it to do without adequate compensation. Then routine took over, because routine was the only thing that worked when thinking failed. Coffee first, the cheap kind. He bought it in the big plastic tub from the warehouse grocery store, 30 minutes south. The kind that came in a red container with a logo that promised morning energy and delivered something closer to hot bitterness. He didn't mind. He'd stopped minding things like coffee quality, somewhere around the 2nd year of doing this alone. While the coffee ran, he made lunch. Emma had an 8 a.m. class on Tuesday with kindness. Class on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which meant she left the apartment at 7:15, which meant she needed something she could eat in the car because she would not wake up early enough to eat it at the table, no matter how many times he suggested it. He made a sandwich. Turkey, mustard, 1 slice of provolone because she'd once mentioned she liked it and he'd been buying it ever since without being asked again. He cut the crusts off. She was 19. She could eat the crusts. She had been eating the crusts for 2 years. He was fairly certain, when she bought food on her own. But he cut them anyway. Not because she needed it, because it was the version of the thing he could still do. The small, quiet version of saying I'm here, that didn't require him to stop moving long enough to actually say it. He put the sandwich in a container, added an apple, added a napkin, which she would not use but which he included, because his own father had always included lit one, and some habits were structural, built so deep into the architecture of a person that removing them would require demolishing something else to get at them. By the time he poured his coffee into the travel mug, the apartment was still gray and quiet. Rain on the window. Seattle in October was nothing but rain and the particular gray that lived behind it, a color that wasn't quite silver and wasn't quite concrete, just the specific shade the sky turned when it was serious about being overcast. He stood at the kitchen window for a moment and drank his coffee and looked at the street below where nothing was moving yet, except a delivery truck idling at the corner its hazard lights throwing orange pulses against the wet asphalt. 5 years he'd worked at Meridian Logistics. 5 years of the same drive up I-5, the same parking garage, the same open-plan floor with its gray partition walls and its smell of recycled air and someone's perpetual microwave lunch. It was not a glamorous job. Senior project manager at a mid-size logistics company meant he was the person who made sure other people's timelines held, that the spreadsheets matched reality, that the quarterly projections, that the executives presented in their good suits were actually built on something true. It meant he was essential in the way that load-bearing walls were essential. Nobody looked at him and thought extraordinary. They looked at him and thought reliable. They counted on him not to collapse. For 5 years that had been enough. More than enough. He could leave at 5. He could pick Emma up from her afternoon shift at the coffee shop when her car was in the shop. He could be there. That was the entire point of the job ultimately. Not the job itself. What the job made possible. Then Meridian got bought. He'd heard the rumors for 2 months before it happened. The kind of rumors that circulate through an office, in the negative space of conversations, in the pauses before someone changes the subject, in the way the CFO started keeping his office door closed at hours when it used to be open. Acquisition talk, restructuring talk, the vocabulary of corporate transformation, which was a language designed to make inevitable losses sound like exciting opportunities. He had not thought much about it. He had enough to think about. The Monday it actually happened, Marcus Webb, who had run Meridian for 11 years, and who Ryan had genuinely liked in the uncomplicated way you like someone who leaves you alone to do your work, was clearing out his desk by 9 in the morning. Not packing, exactly. Would you treat them with kindness, with the flat, deliberate efficiency of someone who had been told to be gone by a specific time and was going to meet that deadline the same way he'd met every other one? Ryan had watched him from across the floor and felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't immediately name. Not grief. Not quite. Something more like recognition. The end of a particular kind of safety. Wednesday came. No announcement before she arrived. No memo, no all-hands calendar invite, no preparatory email from HR reminding them to be welcoming and professional. Just a black Escalade, pulling up to the building at 7:45 in the morning. And then 15 minutes later, a woman walking through the glass doors of the Meridian office floor, like she had been walking through those doors her entire career and had simply been out of the building for a few days. Rebecca Sanchez. Ryan knew the name. Everyone in logistics knew the name. She was 40 years old and she had been written about in 3 national business publications in the past 18 months, which was not a thing that happened to people who weren't doing something that made other people nervous. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd started in procurement at 22, built her first company by 29, sold it, built another one, sold that, and then started acquiring companies outright instead of building them from scratch, which was apparently more efficient if what you were after was scale, and you already understood exactly what made a logistics operation fail. The financial press called her a visionary. The people who'd worked for her called her a machine. He had not entirely believed either description until she walked into the room. She was tall, dark hair, pulled back in a way that required no particular effort to appear severe because severity was the default state, not the performance. She wore a charcoal suit that fit the way expensive things fit, like it had been built around her specifically, rather than selected from available options. She was, by any straightforward accounting, strikingly beautiful. The kind of beautiful that didn't soften anything. The kind that operated at the same temperature as the rest of her, which was the temperature of something that had decided warmth was a liability and proceeded accordingly. She stood at the front of the office floor, and she did not use the microphone that someone from IT had set up on the small podium near the window. She didn't need it. When she spoke, the room arranged itself around her voice without being asked. I don't care how you did things yesterday. Flat and even and entirely without performance. This company is bleeding money because of inefficiency dressed up as process. You've been comfortable. Comfort is where companies go to become irrelevant. She looked around the room once, slow and deliberate, and Ryan had the sensation of being assessed rather than addressed, of being one data point in a much larger calculation. From this point forward, Ashworth Dynamics expects your complete focus. If you have side work that takes your attention, end it. If you have distractions, eliminate them. We work until the job is done. If that doesn't work for your life, the exit is behind you. I'll write the recommendation myself. I'm not cruel. I'm just not interested in compromise. Nobody moved, which was its own kind of answer. She gave them 2 days to adjust. Then she started making decisions. The first, treat them with kindness. The first person to go was Sandra from marketing, who had been at Meridian for 7 years, and who made the mistake of sending an email at 10 in the morning asking whether the new ownership would be reviewing the company's existing wellness stipends. It was a reasonable question. It was the wrong question to ask in the first 48 hours of a regime change. Sandra was gone by 3 that afternoon. Then, Dimitri, from product development, who told Rebecca in a team meeting that a particular implementation timeline was realistically impossible without offering an alternative. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment and said, "Find someone who doesn't know what's impossible, and have them try." Dimitri cleaned out his desk the next morning. Then Timothy Clark. Timothy was in accounting. He sat 2 rows over from Ryan, and he had been at Meridian for 4 years. And he had one of those personalities that made a shared office bearable. Would you treat them with kindness? The kind that noticed when the vending machine ate your dollar and found you later to give you a replacement dollar from his own wallet, not making a thing of it, just correcting an injustice. His wife had been 9 months pregnant since mid-September. She went into labor on a Tuesday. Timothy came in anyway, worked until noon, and then went to Rebecca's office and knocked on the door. Ryan couldn't hear the conversation from his desk. Would you treat them with kindness? He watched it through the glass partition, watched Timothy's posture, which started squared and professional, and slowly shifted into something smaller and more careful. Watched Rebecca's expression, which didn't shift at all. What Ryan found out later, from Marcus before he fully disappeared, was that Timothy had almost said it, almost told her the truth. But when he stood in front of her desk, and she put her pen down and looked at him, with that particular look that said she was calculating his worth in real time, his nerve failed him. He said family emergency. He said personal situation. He said everything except the actual thing, which was that his wife was in labor 6 miles away and he was trying to be in 2 places at once, and he wasn't doing either of them well. Rebecca knew anyway. She had a gift for knowing. And when she said, "Your priorities are no longer aligned with this company's direction," it wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something worse. It was the logical output of a system that had decided certain things didn't count, applied with perfect consistency. Timothy was escorted out by security with his office plant under one arm and the framed photo of his wife from his desk in his other hand. Ryan watched him go. And then Ryan turned back to his own desk, and he looked at the things on it. The photograph of him with kindness. The photograph of him and Emma at the waterfront, taken 2 summers ago when she was still 17, and they'd gone to the Pike Place market on a Saturday, because she'd never actually been even though they'd lived in Seattle her whole life. The small drawing she'd made for him when she was 12, a crayon thing of a house, with smoke coming from the chimney, and 2 figures out front, one tall and one small. And underneath in her careful child printing, home. He'd had it laminated. He kept it next to his monitor. He opened his desk drawer. He put the photograph in first, then the laminated drawing, which he turned face down so he wouldn't have to look at it as he slid it in. Then he pushed the drawer shut and looked at the bare surface of his desk and felt something he wasn't going to name move through his chest like weather. It was a betrayal, a small, private, invisible betrayal. Nobody saw it happen. Nobody would know it had happened. But he knew, and the knowledge settled in his stomach like a stone that had been there before, but had just become too heavy to pretend wasn't there. He had a mortgage payment due in 18 days. Emma's fall semester tuition installment was due in 3 weeks. He had 1 credit card with a balance that was no longer comfortable to think about, the result of 2 months, when the transmission on his car had gone, and Emma had needed an emergency dental procedure, and the universe had decided these things should happen simultaneously. He could not afford a principled stand. Not right now. Not this month. So he became exactly what the system wanted. He showed up at 7. He spoke in metrics. He nodded at timelines that he privately considered delusional. He answered emails at 10 at night. He was, at the surface of things, the ideal post-acquisition employee, productive, visible, and apparently unencumbered. The first 3 weeks passed this way. Then Rebecca called him into the glass office. Would you treat them with kindness? He'd been in there twice before, back when it was Marcus's office, when Marcus used to keep a ridiculous collection of novelty coffee mugs on his credenza and always offered you one when you came in to talk, a gesture that was small and warm and entirely beside the point of whatever you were there to discuss, which Ryan had found oddly comforting. The mugs were gone. The credenza was gone. The office looked like it had been depressurized. Just the desk and the chair and the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the gray sprawl of South Seattle. And Rebecca standing at those windows when he came in, not sitting, just standing there as if she'd been waiting long enough to find stillness, but not long enough to want comfort. She didn't look at him when he entered. Your Q3 projections on the offshore routing accounts. She finally turned. Her eyes were the specific gray of a winter sky, just before it does something decisive. They're solid. Better than solid. You built margin into the contingency columns without being told to. He said nothing. Compliments from her felt like the opening move of something. I'm putting you on the Vanguard integration. She moved to her desk, pulled up something on her tablet, turned it toward him so he could see the project summary. $60 million merger with a Midwest transport group. We go live in 3 weeks. Would you treat them with kindness? This is the largest deal this company will touch this year, and I need someone who can build a financial architecture that won't fall apart when the client starts asking questions I haven't anticipated. His heart did something complicated. 60 million. Vanguard. He knew what this meant in the building. Everyone knew. Would you treat them with kindness? It was the deal that had been in quiet preparation for 4 months, the one that had caused 2 senior people to work through the holidays last year, before the acquisition even finalized. The one that would either define the company's next decade or expose the limits of its infrastructure in a very public way. It will require 80-hour weeks. She was still talking, weekends included. Complete focus. I don't want to hear about commute times. I don't want to hear about fatigue. And I don't want to hear about anything in your personal life. Can you deliver that? Or do I give this to someone who isn't managing the same competing priorities? She couldn't have known about the competing priorities. He'd scrubbed his desk clean. He'd stopped mentioning Emma in any context. Not in passing. Not in the way that people mention their families in normal offices as casual connective tissue between work conversations. He was invisible as a father. He'd made himself invisible on purpose. She couldn't have known. Or she was guessing. Or she said it to everyone. The same pressure applied to the same point, because she'd identified the soft place in every person, and she pressed on it until she learned what she needed to learn. He thought about Emma's tuition. He thought about the credit card balance. He thought about the conversation he'd had with his landlord 6 weeks ago, casual and friendly, which had nonetheless contained the information that the building was going to be reassessed in the spring, and rents would almost certainly be adjusted. He thought about the laminated drawing in his desk drawer, the one he could no longer see from his desk because he'd put it face down. I can deliver it. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Good. She went back to her screen. He was dismissed. He walked out of the glass office and back to his desk, and he sat down and he put his hands flat on the surface and he breathed. He had just agreed to give 3 weeks of his life to a project with almost no margin for error at a company run by a woman who had demonstrated that she treated human difficulties as inefficiencies to be corrected. He had done this voluntarily. He had done it because the numbers required it. Emma texted him that night while he was still at his desk at 7:45. You coming home? He typed back, couple more hours, sorry. She sent back a thumbs up emoji, which was worse than if she'd said something. The thumbs up was the 19-year-old version of fine, said by Someone who had learned that certain conversations weren't going to happen and had adjusted her expectations accordingly. He stared at the thumb on his screen for a moment and then put his phone face down and went back to the spreadsheet. The first week of the Vanguard integration was the most technically demanding thing he'd done in his professional life. Would you treat them with kindness? Rebecca was running the deal herself, but she needed the financial architecture built correctly underneath her. Needed someone who could take the raw numbers from 3 different accounting systems and 3 different accounting systems and make them legible and defensible. That person was him. Would you treat them with kindness? He built it from the base up, working backward from the merger date, constructing the projections with the kind of precision that required him to not stop thinking about it, even when he physically left the building. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was why he found himself sitting on the couch at 11 at night, with his laptop open and his coffee going cold while Emma watched something in the next room, with the volume low enough that she thought she wasn't bothering him. He heard her through the wall. That was the thing about the apartment. Would you treat them with kindness? It was small enough that he always heard her. The shift of weight on her mattress, the quiet movement in the kitchen when she got up for water at 2 in the morning, the particular rhythm of her voice when she was on the phone with someone and trying to keep it down. He had always found this comforting. It was the sound of her being alive and present and in the same space. Now it felt different. Now it felt like evidence of something he was failing at. Sharon Ramirez, Emma's friend from high school who lived 2 floors up in the same building, started coming over on weekday evenings. Ryan noticed this without saying anything about it. Sharon would arrive around 6, and he'd hear them in Emma's room, voices and occasional laughter, and something in him was grateful, and something in him was ashamed to be grateful, because the thing he was grateful for was that Emma had company while he was gone, and the thing he was ashamed of was that Emma needing company while he was gone was a thing he had created. Sharon was 19. She was studying nursing at the community college. She was good for Emma in the way that a person can be good for someone by simply showing up consistently and not requiring anything complicated in return. Ryan appreciated her without having said so. Would you treat them with kindness? He communicated his appreciation by making sure there was always food in the apartment, the kind Emma and Sharon liked, because it was the only thing he could do from a distance. The second week, Emma stopped leaving a light on in the kitchen for him. She had always left the light on. Since she was 12 and they'd moved into the first apartment after Ryan's marriage ended, she had left the small light over the stove on when she went to bed before him. This small orange warmth visible from the front door when he came in, and he had always seen it and felt, despite everything, like he was expected, like someone was accounting for his return. The habit had continued through every apartment since, through the teenage years and the first year of college, through everything. One night he came home at 9:45, and the kitchen was dark. He stood in the doorway and looked at the darkness for a moment longer than made sense, and then he turned on the light himself and made a sandwich and ate it standing up and didn't think about what it meant, or tried not to. He thought about it anyway. He was leaving the apartment at 6:30 in the morning. Esma's light came on at 7:15. Would you treat them with kindness? They were passing each other in a schedule that had no overlap, existing in the same space at hours when neither of them was fully conscious. On a Wednesday night, he came home at 10 and found a note on the kitchen counter, written on the back of an envelope from the college. Ate with Sharon. Leftovers in the fridge. And then her name abbreviated the way she'd signed things since she was small. E. He read the note 3 times. Then he put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept takeout menus and rubber bands and the spare key for a lock he'd since changed. The drawer where small domestic objects accumulated without purpose. He didn't throw it away. He wasn't sure why. Would you treat them with kindness? On a Thursday in the 3rd week, he was at his desk at 6:50 in the morning, building the last section of the Q4 projections that Rebecca would need for the final Vanguard presentation. The presentation was in 4 days. Everything he had built was converging toward that moment. $60 million. 3 weeks of 80-hour investment. The bonus attached to the deal's close was more money than he had made in 6 months. It would pay off the credit card. It would cover Emma's spring semester. It would put 3 months of rent into savings and let him breathe in a way he had not breathed in 2 years. Rebecca walked the floor every morning at 7. She didn't ask questions. She walked and she watched. She watched, the way a person walks through a facility they own when what they want is to see this actual state of things rather than the curated version that gets reported upward. People sat straighter when she passed. Ryan had stopped noticing this effect on himself, which probably meant it had become structural, which was not a thing he wanted to examine too closely. She stopped at his desk, looked at his screen, looked at the projection model he was building, the nested formulas, the color-coded contingency layers, the timeline that accounted for variables he'd discovered in the 3rd week that nobody had thought to flag in the original deal parameters. She stood there for maybe 45 seconds without saying anything. Then she said, "The Detroit hub numbers. You recalibrated." It wasn't a question. "When did you find the discrepancy?" he told her. She nodded once, not in approval exactly, but in the way of someone marking a data point. She moved on. That was the closest thing to acknowledgement he'd received in 3 weeks. He noted it without pleasure. He had learned to operate in this environment the way a sailor learns to operate in a particular climate, not comfortable with the conditions but adapted to them, with the specific adaptations becoming invisible over time. That was the morning he got the call. He was at his desk at 12:43. The presentation was at 1 o'clock, which meant he had 17 minutes to finish the final check on the Q4 numbers and get his slides into the system and walk to the boardroom and present $60 million worth of financial architecture to a woman who would find any error in it, no matter how small, and would find it in front of everyone. He had been awake since 4:45. He had skipped lunch. He had not stopped moving since he sat down that morning, and the spreadsheet was almost done, and he was so close to the finish of this particular thing that he could feel the end of it in his chest like a loosening. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Seattle Community College Student Affairs Office. His stomach dropped. The school never called. It was in the nature of Emma's age that her school called her, not him. He wasn't an emergency contact at 19. Except he was. She'd listed him. He knew she'd listed him, because she'd asked if it was okay before the fall semester, and he'd said yes, and filed the fact away, and had not thought about it since. He looked at the phone. He looked at the clock on his screen. He looked at the boardroom through the glass wall. Would you treat them with kindness? Where someone was already setting up the display for the 1 o'clock meeting, and where Rebecca's assistant was arranging the presenter materials with the focused precision of a person who understood that anything less than ready would be addressed. Behind him, the familiar sharp rhythm of Rebecca's heels on the floor, moving from the back of the office toward the front. Her morning walk delayed, coming his way. Don't answer it. He knew the reasonable calculus. He knew what the sensible move was. He knew that there were 7 kindness. He knew that there were 17 minutes until the most important presentation of his career at this company, and that Emma was 19 and whatever the school was calling about could wait 20 minutes and could be managed after the meeting, and was almost certainly something administrative, a missing form, a billing question, something that would take 3 minutes to resolve. The phone kept buzzing. He picked it up. He stepped away from his desk and put the phone to his ear, and something in his voice changed when he said hello, went lower and quieter, and he heard the voice on the other end, and it wasn't billing, and it wasn't a missing form. George White was the academic counselor for the Social Sciences Division. Ryan knew him from the fall orientation. A steady-voiced man in his 40s who had shaken Ryan's hand at the parent information session and said Emma seemed sharp and that she'd do well if she could learn to trust her own instincts and stop second-guessing herself on the assessments. Ryan had liked him immediately for seeing that thing about her, that particular self-doubt she'd carried since she was small, that hesitation before the answer she already knew. Mr. Robinson White's voice was careful, not alarmed. The voice of someone who was working to manage the temperature of the conversation before it started. I need you to come to campus. Emma left in the middle of her midterm. The words landed wrong, like a sentence he'd misheard. She what? She had a conflict with Professor Hensley. The nature of it isn't entirely clear yet. She walked out of the exam room with 40 minutes remaining. She argued with Professor Hensley in the hallway, which other students witnessed, and then she left the building. We believe she's in her car in the east parking lot. She's not responding to calls from our office. Emma had never walked out of an exam. Emma had never argued with a professor, or if she had, she'd done it in the contained way she did most things, the way she'd learned early to contain the things that threatened to overflow. She was not a person who made scenes. She was not a person who walked out of rooms. Is she hurt? The question was immediate, not physically, a pause. But she's been in that parking lot for over an hour, and she won't answer her phone, and she won't come inside, and we can't leave a student in that state without follow-up. We need you here, Mr. Robinson. He was already standing. He hadn't decided to stand. He was just standing, his jacket half on, his phone pressed to his ear, his other hand finding his car keys in his pocket. He was standing because there was a version of this conversation where he sat back down. And then there was the version where he went to his daughter. He knew which version he was going to choose. He'd known it the second he heard, "She's been in that parking lot for over an hour." Rebecca was at the edge of his workspace. She wasn't looking at him directly. She was looking at the boardroom, at the clock, at the display, being set up for a meeting that required his participation in 12 minutes. But she was aware of him. She was aware of everything in her perimeter at all times. He had learned this. He hung up. He finished putting on his jacket. Her voice, when she spoke, was exactly what he'd expected. Low and even and carrying perfectly in the open-plan silence that had developed around them as people realized something was happening. The Vanguard presentation is in 11 minutes. Not a question. Not a threat yet. Just the fact presented plainly. He looked at her. My daughter is sitting in a parking lot alone and not answering her phone. His voice came out steadier than he expected. I'm going to her. A beat. She tilted her head slightly, the way she tilted her head when she was processing information she hadn't anticipated. You're the lead analyst. The Q4 projections can't be presented without everything is in the shared drive. He picked up his bag. Every model. Every contingency layer. Every formula with annotation. Your team can read it. I don't pay your team to read files. I pay you to, I know what you pay me to do. He said it without heat, without apology. Looking at her directly, the way he had not let himself look at her since the first day Shift walked into this building, because looking at her directly had felt like something that cost too much. The files are there. My daughter isn't answering her phone. I'm going. The room had gone completely still. Not silent, the building system still ran, the heating still moved. Somewhere, a phone still rang and went to voicemail. But the 34 people with an eyeline had all stopped making the small ambient sounds of people working, the keyboard clicks and the chair shifts and the pages turning, and the resulting quiet was the kind that made the air feel different. She stepped forward once. Just once. It wasn't a block. It was something else. A test, maybe, or the last version of the offer before it expired. You are at the finish line of 3 weeks of work. The deal closes today or it doesn't close this quarter. You understand what you're walking away from. He did understand. He understood perfectly. He understood what the bonus meant and what walking away from it meant. And he did the math in the time it took him to respond. The fast and terrible math of rent and tuition and credit card interest. And the answer didn't change. Then it doesn't close this quarter. He said it the way he'd said everything in the last 20 seconds. Without heat, without drama, in the voice of someone who has made the calculation and come out the other side and is now just stating the result. Fire me if you need to. I'll sign whatever I need to sign before I leave the building. But I'm going to my daughter. He walked. Past her, past the boardroom, past the 34 people who had stopped breathing for the last 90 seconds and now watched him cross the office floor with his bag over his shoulder and his keys already in his hand. He pressed the elevator button. He waited the 4 seconds it took for the door to open. He stepped inside. The last thing he saw before the door closed was Rebecca Sanchez standing in the center of the office floor, not moving, not speaking. watching him go with an expression he had no language for. He stood in the elevator and rode it down 13 floors, and when the lobby doors opened, he walked through them into the rain. Cold, immediate. The particular Seattle rain of October that came down light and constant, the kind scent that soaked through everything before you registered it was happening. He walked to the parking garage. He found his car. He sat in the driver's seat for exactly 3 seconds, letting himself understand what he'd just done, and then he started the engine and pulled out and drove toward Emma. The drive was 11 minutes on a good day. Today, with the traffic and the rain and the signals timing that seemed designed for a version of the city that no longer existed, it was 17. He did not turn on the radio. He drove in the particular silence that comes after a major decision, when the decision has been made and the consequences have been set in motion, and there is nothing left to do except drive toward what comes next. He thought about Emma with kindness. He thought about Emma at 12, signing the two of them into a lease at their first apartment with handwriting that was careful and precise because she'd practiced her signature on 3 sheets of notebook paper before they went into the office. He thought about Emma at 15, calling him from school in a voice she was working very hard to keep steady, saying she'd failed a test she'd been sure she would pass. Would you treat them with kindness? And the way he'd heard underneath the steadiness the thing she was actually saying, which was, I thought I was better at this. He thought about Emma at 17 at the waterfront, squinting into the sun off Elliott Bay, saying, do you think we'll always live in Seattle? And him saying, I don't know, do you want to? And her saying, I want to live somewhere with mountains. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was a sentence that had stayed with him because there were mountains visible from Seattle on a clear day, had been the whole time. And he wasn't sure if she hadn't noticed, or if she had and was hoping for something farther. He pulled into the Seattle Community College parking lot. East lot. He found it without difficulty. Would you treat them with kindness? He'd been here twice before, both times for orientation events, both times standing slightly to the side of the other parents who all seemed to have achieved something in the interim since their children started college that Ryan had not yet achieved, which was comfort with the idea of this particular transition. He saw Emma's car from across the lot. The blue Honda with the dent on the rear quarter panel from a parking garage encounter 2 years ago that he'd never gotten around to fixing. The windows were fogged on the inside. He also saw, parked 2 spaces down, a black Escalade. He knew that car. He'd watched it pull up to the Meridian building 17 times in 3 weeks. He'd watched it idle in the drop-off zone, on mornings when Rebecca arrived late, which was never, and on mornings when she arrived early, which was always. And he knew that car, the way you know any vehicle that appears in your peripheral vision, consistently enough to become a landmark. He stopped walking. He stood in the rain, and he looked at the black Escalade, and at Emma's fogged windows, and at the figure he could now see sitting on the hood of the Escalade, her jacket on despite the rain, her posture the same as it was in every room she occupied, straight, composed, like a person who had decided that weather was a condition to be noted and then ignored. She was holding 2 coffee cups, and a white paper bag from a bakery Ryan had never been able to afford to go into. He stood there in the rain and tried to understand what he was looking at. Rebecca Sanchez had left his meeting, had left his $60 million presentation. Would you treat them with kindness? Had gotten in her car and driven 11 minutes through Seattle traffic in the rain to sit on the hood of her Escalade in a community college parking lot next to his daughter's Honda, holding coffee. Yes, she had bought from a high-end bakery with a white paper bag he was now close enough to read the logo on, and she had apparently been sitting there long enough for the coffee to still be warm, but for the windows of Emma's car to have fogged significantly, which put her arrival at somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes ago. He couldn't do the math on this. He couldn't put it into the same column as everything else he knew about her. It didn't fit. Emma's door opened. He saw it from across the lot, the small mechanical release, the door swinging out. Emma stepped out, in her rain jacket, her dark hair damp at the edges, her face doing the thing it did when she had been crying, and was in the afterward of that, when the crying was done, but the geography of it was still visible. She looked at Ryan across the distance of the parking lot. He crossed it, and when he reached her and she said, "You didn't have to come," He understood. This was the only thing she knew how to say, when the thing she wanted to say was something much larger and much more frightening, and she was working up to it or working away from it, or both simultaneously. He understood this because he had spent 19 years learning to translate the space between what Emma said and what Emma meant. And this particular distance was not a small one. Yes, I did. He said it the way you say the only true thing left. She didn't respond. She looked at Rebecca, who had slid off the hood of the Escalade and was now standing at a respectful distance that was still somehow not distant at all, her presence large in the specific way it was always large. And Emma looked at this woman who had materialized in her parking lot with bakery goods and said, "Who is this?" Ryan opened his mouth, and before he could answer, Rebecca Sanchez held out the white paper bag and said, simply, in a voice that had lost something of its usual precision, something he could not quite identify but that made her sound, for the first time since he'd known her, like someone who was trying, "I was in the area." Emma looked at the bag, looked at Ryan, looked at the bag again, and in the particular calculus of a 19-year-old who has been sitting alone in a fogged car for over an hour, having a very bad morning, and who has just been offered pastry by a stranger, in a good suit, she took the bag. And Ryan stood, in the rain between the two of them, and felt the ground beneath him shift in a way he recognized as the beginning of something, though he couldn't yet see the shape of it from where he was standing. The rain came down. The lot was empty except for them. Emma pulled a croissant from the bag and ate a piece of it, and said nothing for a moment. And the nothing stretched out in the way that significant nothings do. Then she looked at Ryan and said, "Bo cognò l'encu." She stopped, switched languages. Old habit, the way she'd code switch back to the few phrases of his mother's language he'd taught her when she was small, the ones that had become their private shorthand for serious things. She said it again, in English. "Do you remember the last time you asked me how school was going?" He did not answer immediately, because the answer was no, and because no was a word that landed differently depending on what it was no to, and what it was no to here was not something small. He said no. She nodded, not angry, something quieter than angry, which was harder. "Would you treat them with kindness?" She ate another piece of the croissant and looked out at the gray middle distance of the parking lot, at the line of cars belonging to students who were currently inside doing the things students did on a Thursday at 1 in the afternoon. And Ryan stood next to her, in the rain, and understood, with the clarity that comes after a decision rather than before it, that the past 3 weeks had cost something he had not fully accounted for. He had been running the wrong set of books. Rebecca spoke first, which was not surprising. She always spoke first, in every room, in every silence, as if silence were a resource she didn't believe in wasting on waiting. But the way she spoke was different here. Smaller, less architecture to it, more like someone trying a door they weren't sure would open. She wasn't answering her phone. Matter of fact, standing in the rain with the white paper bag now half empty between them. I tried knocking on the window. She didn't unlock it. So I sat on the hood and waited. Ryan looked at her. "You knocked on her window." "I had coffee." People generally respond to coffee. Emma, eating her croissant with the focused attention of someone who had decided food was a more manageable problem than feelings, glanced up at this. "She also told me the croissants were from a place on Capitol Hill that doesn't take walk-ins. You have to order 24 hours ahead." A pause. "How did you order them if you left the building 20 minutes ago?" Rebecca's expression didn't shift. "I keep a standing order." Emma considered this. "You keep a standing order at a bakery." "I keep standing orders at 7 establishments. It's efficient." This was so perfectly, specifically Rebecca, that Ryan almost laughed, and then didn't. Because laughing felt like releasing something he wasn't ready to release yet, some tension that was still doing load-bearing work in his chest. Emma looked at Ryan with the particular expression she'd worn since she was 12 when she encountered something she found genuinely strange but was trying to assess fairly. "She says she works with you. She owns the company I work for." A beat. Owned. She might own it alone now. "Rebecca, the situation remains undetermined." "Emma, that means you didn't fire him." "Rebecca, it means I haven't decided." Emma looked between them, ate another piece of croissant. "Okay. Just that. The most 19-year-old response available. Okay. As in, this is clearly complicated and I am going to keep eating and let it resolve itself. Ryan turned to face Rebecca fully. The rain had soaked through the shoulders of his jacket. She looked the same as she always did. Impervious. But standing here in the east parking lot of a community college, with Cleve croissant crumbs on the sleeve of her charcoal jacket, which she either hadn't noticed or had noticed and decided not to care about, she looked different in some way he didn't have the exact word for. Not smaller, not softer, just more present, like someone who had stepped out of the frame they usually occupied and was now visible in 3 dimensions. Why did you come here? Not a question exactly. More like an accusation that had lost most of its edge on the drive over. She was quiet for a moment. 3 seconds, 5. Would you treat them with kindness? Long enough that he thought she might not answer, that she might redirect the conversation back to the meeting and the timeline and the $60 million, which was the language she spoke most fluently and the one she returned to when other languages got difficult. Instead, she said, "When you walked into that elevator, you did something I have not seen in 10 years of running companies. You chose a consequence you could see over an approval you could keep." She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at some middle point between him and the car. I didn't know what to do with that. So I followed it. Emma had gone very still, croissant halfway to her mouth. Ryan said nothing. Would you treat them with kindness? He was processing something that didn't process easily, which was the image of Rebecca Sanchez sitting alone on the hood of her Escalade in the rain for 30 minutes, waiting, without her phone open, without her tablet, without the infrastructure of productivity she carried everywhere like a second skeleton. Just sitting, waiting for a girl who wasn't her responsibility to decide whether to open her car door. You were just going to sit there. He said it before he'd decided to say it. Until she unlocked the car or someone from campus security came and made things awkward. Yes. Emma put the croissant down on top of the bag. Would you treat them with kindness? She looked at Rebecca with the directness that Ryan had always privately thought was her most powerful quality, the ability to look at something straight on when everyone around her was looking slightly away from it. My dad hasn't been home before 9 o'clock in 3 weeks. Rebecca said nothing. He missed my midterm review. The one I had to reschedule because the original date conflicted with something at his office. I rescheduled it for a Monday and he knew about it, and he still came home at 10:30. She said this without heat. That was the thing that made it worse. She said it the way you state a fact when the fact has had enough time to finish being surprising and become just true. And today I had Professor Hensley's exam, which I've been studying for since October 2nd, and I went in and I sat down, and I looked at the first question, and She stopped. I couldn't remember why it mattered. Silence, October rain. Somewhere across the lot, a car started and pulled out, its headlights sweeping briefly across the 3 of them. Ryan felt the sentence land in the specific way that certain sentences land, not as information but as something more structural, something that shifts the foundation rather than adding to the surface. He had heard Emma say harder things. He had heard her, at 13, tell him with devastating composure that she didn't blame him for how things went with her mother, which he had understood, even then was a sentence that contained its opposite buried inside it. He had heard her at 16 say she was fine about the thing that was clearly not fine in that particular teenage register of fine, that meant the conversation was over, but the thing wasn't. But this was different. Would you treat them with kindness? This was a 19-year-old sitting in a rainy parking lot telling him in plain English that she had looked at the work she cared about and not been able to find the thread back to why it mattered. And the reason she couldn't find it had his name on it. He said, She didn't look at him. I'm not trying to make you feel bad. I know, I'm just saying what happened. I know. Because you asked why I was in the parking lot, and that's why. He hadn't asked. But she'd answered the question underneath the one he hadn't asked yet, which was always how Emma communicated the things that actually mattered. You had to listen for the question she was answering rather than the one that got spoken. He moved toward her. She let him. That was the thing about Emma at her hardest. She let him always, even when the walls were up, even when she'd decided to be fine about everything. She let him put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it at an angle that was trying not to look like leaning, and was completely leaning anyway. And they stood like that in the parking lot rain, while Rebecca stood at a distance that had become, somehow, a respectful one. Then Emma said, into his jacket shoulder, she sat on the hood of her car for like 45 minutes. In the rain. In that suit. Ryan, I noticed. Emma, that's unhinged behavior. Rebecca, from a distance that was not quite far enough. I can hear you. Emma, without lifting her head, I know. Something shifted. Not resolved. Not even close to resolved. But shifted. The way a joint shifts after a long time in one position. The relief of movement even if the movement isn't comfortable. Ryan looked at Rebecca over the top of Emma's head. You have a $60 million meeting you left. I have a capable team, and a shared drive full of your projections. Not quite dismissive, more like she had done the risk calculation and reached a conclusion she was going to live with. The meeting started 11 minutes ago. Margaret from the integration team is presenting. She has adequate command of the material. Margaret has never presented to a client at this level. Then today is her opportunity to become someone who has. A pause. Your numbers are correct. The architecture holds. If it doesn't close today on the strength of what you built, it won't close because of anything Margaret does or doesn't say. It will close because the deal itself is sound. He looked at her for a moment. You believe that? I believe your work is sound. I checked it, simple. You built a margin into every contingency column. The model accounts for variables the client hasn't thought to ask about yet. When they do ask, the answer is already there. Something moved through her expression, quick and contained, something he almost missed. You built it so that it could stand without you. That's not an accident. It wasn't. He'd built it that way on purpose, the specific paranoid thoroughness of a person who had learned that nothing stays in your control as long as you plan for it to. He'd built it to be readable without him, because he'd been unable, 3 weeks ago, to fully believe he would still be here when the meeting happened. Emma had straightened up. She was listening with the focused quality she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. Her head slightly tilted, her eyes moving between Ryan and Rebecca the way they moved over a page she was trying to understand. So, you came here instead of staying for the meeting. Emma addressed this to Rebecca. After he left. Rebecca, yes. Emma, why? And here it was. The question Ryan had not quite been able to formulate. Emma had gotten there in 11 seconds flat because she had no institutional relationship with Rebecca, no 3 weeks of learned deference. No professional survival calculus running underneath every interaction. She was just a 19-year-old in a rain jacket who had been sitting alone in a car for an hour and who was now asking a direct question to the person who hadn't answered it yet. Rebecca was quiet. Not the quiet of someone calculating. The quiet of someone deciding how far into something they're willing to go. And then she sat back down on the hood of the Escalade, which was a thing Ryan would not have predicted she'd do. And she said, "My father worked at a steel plant outside Pittsburgh for 26 years. Would you treat them with kindness?" She said it the way you say things that have been said inside your head for so long that they've lost the quality of disclosure and become something closer to statement. He ran the overnight welding line. He did it so I could go to the good school. The kind with the small classes and the teachers who knew your name. He thought that was the trade worth making. Emma was very still. He had a heart attack on the plant floor when I was 16. He died before the paramedics got there. A beat? Just one. The company sent a ham to our house, and a card that said in appreciation of his dedication. My mother sold the house 30 days later. Rain on the car hoods, rain on the asphalt, rain doing what Seattle rain did, which was to continue without comment or escalation. Emma said quietly, "I'm sorry." Rebecca looked at her. Not through her the way she sometimes looked through people, but at her, with something that was working to stay controlled and was managing it but only just. I spent the next 24 years building something that couldn't be sent home with a ham. Something that had my name on it. My decisions in it. She paused. I became very good at it. You became the plant, Emma said. Rebecca didn't answer immediately. And the not answering was its own answer, the kind that has already been said and acknowledged. somewhere prior to this conversation in private, and is now being confirmed publicly for the first time. Ryan watched her. He was learning something about her in this parking lot that he had not been able to learn in 3 weeks of proximity inside that building, something that the glass walls and the controlled distance had kept hidden. Not a different person, the same person, with the architecture visible for the first time. The thing underneath the structure of her. I told your father on day one that I don't want distractions in my building. She was looking at Emma, not Ryan. That's what I said. And I believed it. And today he walked out of a meeting to come to you, and I didn't know what to do with someone who believed something more than they believed me. Another pause, shorter, so I followed him here, and I sat on my car, and I waited to see what it looked like from the outside. Emma looked at her for a long moment. What does it look like? Rebecca considered this with more seriousness than the question probably expected. Like something I forgot was possible. The three of them sat with that for a moment, not an uncomfortable silence. A full one. The kind that follows a sentence that has used up all the available air and needs a moment before anything else can be said. Then Emma looked at Ryan. And she said, in the tone she used when she was done, being in her feelings, and was ready to be practical, which was a gear change he'd always found remarkable, that she could move through things and then come out the other side still functional. Did you actually quit your job? Ryan, more or less. Emma, more or less as in yes. Ryan, as in I told her to fire me and then left the building. Emma looked at Rebecca. Did you fire him? Rebecca, I haven't decided. Emma, you drove 11 minutes in traffic to bring him a croissant. Rebecca, the croissants were incidental. Emma, the croissants were not incidental. Nobody keeps a standing order at a walk-in only bakery and calls it incidental. She picked up the white paper bag, looked in it, pulled out a second croissant, handed it to Ryan without looking at him. You should eat something. You skipped lunch. He took the croissant. He ate a piece of it. It was, objectively, the best croissant he had eaten in his life, which felt like important information at a deeply inappropriate moment. Rebecca said, come back Thursday. Ryan stopped chewing. Take tomorrow. Full pay. Come back Thursday at 9. Not 7. Not 6:30. 9. She slid off the hood again, straightened her jacket, brushed at the sleeve where the croissant crumbs had been, which she had apparently noticed but had been tabling. When you are in the building, I need you to work with the same complete disregard for my approval that you demonstrated today. When you are not in the building, I need you to not be in the building. She looked at Emma briefly. That's not a test, it's a structural change. Ryan said, why? Not hostile, genuinely. He needed to know why, because the why was the thing that would tell him whether Thursday was real or whether it was an offer that would look different once he was back inside those walls and the machinery had resumed. Rebecca looked at him, and she said, without any of the business register precision she usually deployed, because I have spent 12 years building something by not trusting anyone. And I have a very good company and I have nothing else. A pause that she didn't try to fill. I'm not interested in the same outcome for the next 12. He said nothing. Would you treat them with kindness? He looked at her in the rain in the parking lot of a community college, in the specific October light of Seattle that turned everything the color of something almost resolved, and he did not know yet what Thursday would look like, or what she meant, or whether the offer was as true as it sounded. But he knew that she had driven here. She had sat on the hood of her car. She had knocked on Emma's window with coffee and pastry. She kept on standing order at a place she apparently never visited spontaneously. Would you treat them with kindness? She had done all of this when the alternative was staying in a boardroom for a $60 million presentation that was, by her own assessment, going to close anyway. People did not do things for no reason. Even her. Especially her. She turned toward her car, then stopped, and without turning back around, she said, negotiations always go smoother with pastry, Robinson. Remember that. And she got into the Escalade, and she drove away. Emma watched the car go. Then she turned to Ryan with an expression he recognized as the one she wore when she was processing something complex, and had decided that humor was the safer side to enter it from. She's insane, he laughed. Actually laughed. The kind that came out of somewhere pressurized and released without warning. Yeah, like genuinely, in a very impressive way. Yeah. He looked at the space where the car had been. Yeah, she is. Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, are you going to go back? He thought about it. Honestly thought about it, standing in the parking lot with rain in his hair, and a croissant in his hand and 3 weeks of terrible math sitting in his chest. He thought about the filing cabinet of reasons he'd had for the choices of the last 3 weeks. The tuition, the rent, the credit card balance. All still true. All still present. None of them had changed in the last 40 minutes. But something else had. Something harder to name than a number. I don't know yet, he said. True. Ask me Thursday. Emma nodded, picked up her bag from where she'd put it on the hood of her car, pulled out her keys. I'm going back inside to talk to George White and figure out what happens with the midterm. Do you want me to come in with you? She thought about it, actually considered it, which told him it wasn't reflexive no. No. I think I need to handle Professor Hensley myself. A pause. But maybe you could be at the apartment tonight. Like, actually at the apartment. Not at your desk. Not on your laptop. Just. There, yeah. No hesitation. Yeah, I'll be there. She looked at him for a moment with the expression that had no easy name, the one she wore when she had decided something was enough for now. Then she said, she left you a croissant. He looked down at his hand. I know. That's either a severance package or an apology. I can't tell which. Probably both. She opened her car door. I like her, for the record, in a concerning way. He watched her go back inside. Then he stood in the parking lot alone for a minute, rain on his shoulders, second-best croissant of the decade in his hand. Would you treat them with kindness? Thinking about a woman who kept standing orders at bakeries she didn't go to and sat alone in parking lots waiting for people who weren't her responsibility. He got in his car and he drove home, and he did not open his laptop. He was there when Emma came back at 4:30. Would you treat them with kindness? She came in and dropped her bag and went to the kitchen and started opening cabinets with the focused energy of someone who had resolved something difficult and was now ready to do something practical. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and nothing in front of him, which was unusual enough that she registered it. How'd it go with White? He asked it like a person who has been thinking about a question for 2 hours and is now choosing to say it out loud. She pulled out a pot, filled it. He's letting me retake the midterm next week. I have to write a half-page explanation of extenuating circumstances. She put the pot on the burner, turned to look at him. What do I say in the extenuating circumstances letter? Say the truth. The truth is that I sat down in the exam room and couldn't remember why any of it mattered, because I've been eating dinner alone for 3 weeks, and it finally hit me all at once, at the worst possible moment. That's the truth. You can't write that. Why not? Because it makes me sound. She stopped, turned back to the pot. It makes me sound like I can't handle my dad having a hard month at work. You handled it, he said. You're here. You went back inside, you talked to White. He looked at his coffee cup. I didn't handle it. That's the distinction. She was quiet for a moment, stirring something that didn't need stirring yet. You came to the parking lot. 3 weeks too late. But you came. Emma. He said her name with kindness. He said her name with the weight of something that had been accumulating since October. Since the first evening she'd texted him you coming home, and he'd typed back couple more hours in a parking garage at 7:45. I put the drawing in the drawer. She looked at him then. The one you made when you were 12. I put it face down in the drawer so nobody at work would know I had a daughter. He said it the way you say the thing you've been least able to say plainly, without protective covering. That was the first thing I did when she walked in. I hid you. Emma looked at him for a long time. The pot behind her had started to heat. The window above the sink was dark with rain. The apartment was the specific warm small of a place where 2 people had lived together, long enough for the space to have absorbed the rhythm of them, the particular way they moved and spoke and didn't speak. I know, she said. You knew. The photo was gone the first week. I noticed when I came to bring you lunch that Wednesday. A pause. I didn't say anything because I thought you needed to figure it out yourself. She turned back to the pot. You did. He sat with this. The particular quiet that comes when someone forgives you something before you've asked for forgiveness, which is either the kindest thing they can do or the most disorienting. And in his experience, it was usually both simultaneously. They ate dinner. Together, at the kitchen table, which had been a surface used primarily for Ryan's paperwork for 3 weeks, and was now what it was supposed to be. A place where two people sat across from each other with food and the small logistical conversations of a shared life. Would you treat them with kindness? Emma told him about Professor Hensley, who was apparently a man with no capacity for the kind of interruption that Emma had generated, but who had also, according to George White, been warned by 2 other professors this semester that his assessment format was creating performance anxiety in students with otherwise strong records, which didn't excuse her walking out, but contextualized it. Ryan listened to all of this and asked questions and did not look at his phone once. After dinner, she washed the dishes and he dried them, the same division they'd had since she was tall enough to reach the sink, and she told him that Sharon had a date on Friday with someone from her nursing program who had texted her 17 times in 3 days, in a way that Sharon felt was either very interested or mildly catastrophic. Ryan said both, probably, and Emma said that was not helpful, and Ryan said he was a single father in his 30s who had not been on a date in 2 years. She should not be coming to him for romantic assessment. And Emma laughed. Actually laughed. The kind that came from somewhere she wasn't offending. That night he unfolded the couch and lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about Thursday. He thought about it the way you think about something when you can't land on a decision, because both options require you to trust something you aren't certain is trustworthy. The option of going back required him to trust that Rebecca's parking lot offer was real. Would you treat them with kindness? The option of not going back required him to trust that he could find something equivalent in a market that had not been particularly generous to 32-year-old project managers who had visibly walked out of a $60 million meeting for personal reasons. He thought about what she'd said, not the part about the meeting closing or the Q4 projections holding. The other part, I have a very good company and I have nothing else. Said in a parking lot in the rain, to him and Emma both, without the specific inflection that meant it was strategy, without the flatness that meant it was armor. Just said, the way something true gets said when the room is empty enough to say it. He thought about her father, the plant. 26 years of night shifts and a ham and a card in the mail. Would you treat them with kindness? He thought about the particular architecture of a person who had built an entire identity around never being that story, who had made herself into the machine rather than the man who got ground up by it, and who had, somewhere in the process, built something that ground people up, not with malice. That was the thing he kept coming back to, not with cruelty as the goal, with efficiency as the goal and cruelty as the byproduct that had never been examined because the goal was working. Wednesday, he spent at home. He took Emma to campus in the morning and picked her up in the afternoon. In between, he did the things he had not done in 3 weeks. He called his landlord back about the spring assessment. He paid the credit card minimum, which was not enough but was what he had without the bonus, and he ran the numbers on what he needed and what the new contract would need to show to make the math work. He went to the grocery store and bought real groceries, not the emergency supply kind but actual food that required cooking. He bought provolone because Emma liked it, and he bought the decent coffee because he'd been drinking the warehouse brand for long enough. He took the laminated drawing out of his briefcase, where he'd moved it from the desk drawer when he cleaned out his desk on the way out of the building. He put it on the kitchen windowsill, where it had been before any of this. Emma saw it when she came home. She didn't say anything about it. She just looked at it for a second. That quick look that people give things they didn't expect to see where they expected to see them. And then she went to put her bag down. He slept on the couch and woke at 4:45 by force of biological habit, even without the alarm. Lay there in the dark. Counted the reasons not to go back. There were legitimate ones. The thing she'd built was still broken in ways that wouldn't be fixed by one conversation in a parking lot. Timothy Clark was still gone. The culture of that floor was still the culture she'd created. And she was still her, with all the history that had made her her. And history didn't rewrite itself because somebody made a decision in a parking lot. But the number on that contract, the number she had not named yet, but that he knew from the position descriptions she would eventually offer, could change everything for M's second year, could close the gap, could turn the math from barely possible to actually possible. And he was, at the end of the accounting, a man with a responsibility that required him to look at math honestly rather than emotionally. He went. Thursday morning, 8:57. He walked into the building in the same jacket he'd worn when he walked out of it. Different shirt, same jacket. Like a statement that wasn't quite a statement but was clearly something intentional. The lobby felt different. Or he did. Hard to know which. The elevator opened on his floor and people looked at him with the specific quality of people who have collectively watched something happen and are not sure what the outcome means for them. Not hostile. Not warm. Suspended. Waiting for data. His desk had been touched. Something had been placed on it while he was gone, sitting on top of his keyboard, directly centered, as if whoever placed it had taken care with the placement. A new frame. Silver edges. Simple. And inside it, face forward, was the laminated drawing. The house with the smoke from the chimney. The two figures out front. Home. In Emma's 12-year-old handwriting. He stood at his desk for a moment. He did not sit down immediately. Would you treat them with kindness? He stood there looking at the drawing in its new frame on his keyboard, and he thought about who had done this and when, because he had taken the drawing home in his briefcase, and it had been on the kitchen windowsill, and he had not brought it back. His desk phone rang. He picked it up. Her voice without preamble, my office. Would you treat them with kindness? He walked down the hall and pushed open the door without knocking, because she hadn't invited him to knock, and not knocking was its own kind of answer to the way she operated. Would you treat them with kindness? And she turned from the window when he came in and looked at him with the expression she wore when she was assessing something she hadn't yet classified. She said, Vanguard closed. 7 last night. Client signed at 7:12. She moved to a desk. Your projections held. Every contingency variable the client raised was already accounted for. She sat, not behind the desk, but in the chair beside it, which he noticed because she never sat anywhere but behind it. Margaret was adequate. The projections did the work. He remained standing. The drawing. Emma messaged me. He was genuinely not prepared for this sentence. She found my contact through the company directory. She sent a photograph of it and asked if I could have it framed and returned to your desk. A pause. She said, and I'm quoting directly, that hiding the important things is what started this whole mess and she thought you should stop. He sat down, uninvited, in the chair across from her, because his legs had made a decision independent of the rest of him. She's right, he said. She frequently is. Rebecca looked at him with something that was not quite the expression he associated with her, not the calculation, and not the armor, but something that lived underneath both of those. Something older. She told me something else. He waited. She said her father cuts the crusts off her sandwiches. That he's done it since she was small, long past when she needed him to. A pause. She said she's never once told him to stop the apartment, the kitchen. 4:45 in the morning, and the cold floor, and the routine that was the structure of the whole thing. The small grammar of a life built around being someone's constant. He didn't say anything. Rebecca looked at her desk, at the surface of it, as if there were something written there that she was reading. My father used to leave the light on over the stove when he worked nights. My mother said it was so that when he came home at 4 in the morning, he wouldn't stumble in the dark. She paused. He was the only one who ever used that light. She left it on for him every night for 26 years. Another pause. After he died, she left it on for 6 more months before she realized she was still doing it. A pause that was different from the others, longer and with something behind it she wasn't quite closing. Would you treat them with kindness? Then she sold the house and there was no stove to leave the light on over. He looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has taken something out to examine it and has not decided yet whether to put it back. He said, I'm coming back. She looked up. I'm coming back Thursday? which is today, which I've already done. And I'll be here Monday. And I'll leave at 5. He said it the way he'd learned to say things clearly in this building, without padding or hedging, just the thing. But Timothy Clark needs to come back too. Her expression didn't change. Not because I owe him anything. Because you fired him for not having the nerve to say his wife was in labor in a building where having that nerve would have cost him his job. That's not his failure. That's the architecture. He looked at her directly. You said you wanted to build something different. The architecture is where you start. She was quiet. This was a different quiet than the ones he'd learned to read over 3 weeks. This was the quiet of someone deciding whether to trust something. A real decision. Not tactical. Something more fundamental. Rebecca said, I'll call Clark this afternoon. He nodded. Once. The contract. She pulled the folder from her desk drawer, slid it across the surface toward him. He'd half expected it to have disappeared to be a parking lot thing that returned to being just rain in the daylight of an actual office. But there it was. His name on the cover. The same folder. Director of Operations. 30% increase. Options vesting at 18 months. Standard hours with authorization required for after 6 access to the network. She folded her hands. There are terms on page 4 that govern the conditions under which the role can be dissolved. Read them. He pulled the folder toward him. Open to page 4. Read the terms. They were, as far as he could tell, fair. Abnormally fair for a contract with her name on it. He looked up. You had a lawyer redraft this. Not a question. Overnight. Also not an apology. He went back to the beginning. Read it through once, methodically, the way he read everything that had consequences. She waited. She did not open her tablet, or check her phone, or do any of the things she normally did in any room she occupied, when waiting wasn't the primary task. She just waited, and the quality of her waiting was different from the quality of everything else about her. More patient than he would have predicted. Like a person who had learned that certain things didn't move faster, just because you wanted them to. He reached the signature page. He took the pen from his inside jacket pocket. The same pen he carried every day, the unremarkable ballpoint he'd been using since the job before this one. He held it over the page. 2 conditions, he said. She raised one eyebrow. Just barely. The closest thing to surprise her face permitted. If you ever drive to Emma's campus again. He kept his voice even. You bring enough for the whole floor. Not just 2. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the beginning of the architecture of 1. And Timothy Clark gets an apology. Not an offer letter. An apology first. From you in person. He held her eyes. Because the system you built told him that telling the truth would cost him his job. And he believed it because it was true. And then you penalized him for doing exactly what the system taught him to do. That's not his fault. And he should hear that from you. A silence. Longer than the others. This was the one he couldn't read. The one that could go either way. The one that hung on something he didn't fully know about her yet. Then she said, Thursday. I'll call him Thursday. He signed the paper. He signed all 7 pages, methodically, in the handwriting he'd had since the 3rd grade. And then he pushed the folder back across the desk to her. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. Don't thank me, he said before she could say whatever she was about to say. She paused. I wasn't going to. Good. He stood up. I'll have the Q1 Midwest projections on your screen by end of day. He walked to the door, then stopped, turned back. One more thing. She waited. The drawing. The one Emma had you frame. He looked at her. How did she have your contact? Rebecca looked at him with an expression that was, for just 1 second, the specific expression of someone who has been caught at something they're not sure how to categorize. Then she said, she looked me up through the business registry. She's quite resourceful. I know she is. He held her gaze. You gave her your cell number. A pause. She asked for it. In the message through the company directory. She said she might have follow-up questions about the framing specifications. He looked at her for a moment. This woman, who had run his floor like a pressure system for 3 weeks. Who kept standing orders at bakeries. Who had sat alone on the hood of her car in the rain for 45 minutes because a 19-year-old she'd never met wouldn't unlock her car door. Framing specifications, he said. She had very specific thoughts about the border width. He turned back to the door. I'll have the projections to you by 4. He walked out and down the hallway, and back to his desk with the laminated drawing in its new silver frame sitting on his keyboard where someone had placed it with care. He picked it up and put it next to his monitor, where it had been before any of this, and he sat down and opened his laptop and started to work. Through the glass wall of her office at the end of the hall, he could see Rebecca. She was on the phone, standing at the window, which is where she went when the call was something she wanted to stand for. Her posture was slightly different than usual. Not relaxed, but something less. Something with more give to it than the usual configuration. He watched her for a second, then he turned back to his screen. He had projections to build. He had a job to do. And he had, for the first time in 3 weeks, the specific equilibrium of a man who knows what he walked toward and what he walked away from and has made his peace with both. The rain on the Seattle window was doing what it always did, coming down steady, coming down without apology. The particular rain of a city that doesn't stop for the inconvenience of circumstances and has never pretended otherwise. He made coffee, the decent kind, from home. In the thermos he'd brought, he poured it. He put Timothy Clark called back at 4:17 on Thursday afternoon. Ryan knew this because he was at his desk when his desk phone rang, and the display showed an outside number he didn't recognize, and he picked it up out of habit. Would you treat them with kindness? And the voice on the other end said his name with the specific quality of someone who has been thinking about making a call for several hours and has finally made it. Timothy sounded different. Not diminished, exactly. More like a person who had been through a compression and come out the other side with their dimensions slightly rearranged. His son was 11 days old. His name was Marcus, which Timothy mentioned in the first 30 seconds, not as a digression, but as a fact that had become the organizing fact of his entire existence, and was therefore relevant to everything. Marcus, 11 days old, doing well. Ryan asked how Timothy was doing, which was a question he meant, and Timothy was quiet for a second and then said, I got a call today from Rebecca Sanchez. Ryan said nothing. She called my cell. Personal number, not through HR. She told me she wanted to speak with me directly. Timothy paused. She told me that the way I left the company was a product of a culture she had built and was responsible for. Not those exact words, but something like that. Another pause, longer. She said the environment made honesty professionally dangerous, and that she had penalized me for responding logically to an environment she'd created, and that she was sorry. Ryan looked at the laminated drawing next to his monitor. The house. The smoke. Home. She offered me my position back, Timothy continued. Same title. Adjusted compensation. A pause. She said the offer had no expiration and that she'd understand if I needed time or if I decided not to come back. Ryan said, What did you say? I said I'd talk to my wife. A beat. Then I called you. Which meant something. Ryan wasn't sure exactly what it meant, whether it was trust or a request for information or something in between. But it meant something that Timothy Clark, 11 days into being a father, with a son named Marcus and a decision of some consequence in front of him, had reached for a phone and dialed. He told Timothy the truth. He told him that the floor was different now, in ways that were still provisional, still being tested, still subject to change, because the person running it was still herself and herself was complicated. He told him that he had signed a contract that included, as a structural element, the ability to leave at 5. Would you treat them with kindness? He told him that Rebecca Sanchez had driven to a community college parking lot in the rain and sat on the hood of her car for 45 minutes waiting for Ryan's daughter to unlock her car door, which was either a sign of profound change or the most unnerving thing he had ever witnessed, and he genuinely wasn't certain which. Timothy was quiet. Then she sat on the hood for 45 minutes. In the rain, it was Seattle. It's always raining in Seattle. That's the point. Timothy made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood of one. Then, my wife says I should go back. She says staying home because the last job was hard is the kind of thing that sounds reasonable in October and regrets itself by February. Ryan said, Your wife sounds smart. She is. A pause. She also says the woman who fired me is the kind of person who either means it when they apologize, or is so calculated that the apology is functionally identical to meaning it. Either way, she said, you get the same outcome. Ryan thought about this. Thought about the parking lot, the croissants, the framing specifications. The way Rebecca had said, I have a very good company and I have nothing else, in the flat, unself-pitying voice of someone stating a fact they had not softened for an audience. She's right, he said. Either way. Timothy called the next morning and accepted. The week after the contract signing was the strangest week Ryan had spent in a professional environment. Strange not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the absence of the thing that had been present for 3 weeks. The pressure that had been as ambient as the building's heating system, and just as invisible until it stopped. The floor was still busy. The work was still hard. The timelines were still aggressive, in the way that Rebecca's timelines were structurally always aggressive, built to the outer edge of what was possible and no further, which was demanding, and also, Ryan was coming to understand, a form of respect. She didn't give you easy targets. She gave you the real ones. But the air was different. People left at 6. Not all of them. And not because they were afraid to stay, but because the stay-late culture that had been enforced through fear had stopped being based, and in the absence of that enforcement, people made normal human calculations about when they'd done enough for the day. Rebecca walked the floor at 7 every morning. She still said almost nothing on these walks, but the quality of the silence was different, less evaluative. More observational, the way a person walks through a place they're responsible for and are genuinely trying to understand rather than audit. She stopped at Ryan's desk on Wednesday of the second week and looked at the Q1 Midwest projections he'd been building, which were more complex than the Vanguard model because they had to account for 3 different seasonal demand patterns and a supply chain variable that nobody had cleanly modeled before. She looked at the screen for a moment and said, you built a second contingency layer. The primary contingency has a gap between weeks 11 and 14. The client's seasonal demand pattern is unpredictable in that window. A single contingency isn't enough. She looked at the model for another moment. You built it overnight. I built it Tuesday evening. I was home by 8. She looked at him. I said not past 6. You said not to log into the network past 6 without authorization. I worked on paper. He kept his voice level. I do some of my best thinking on paper. Something crossed her expression that wasn't quite amusement but was in the adjacent territory. And you didn't feel the need to mention this distinction when I wrote the term. I figured it was implied. Nothing is implied in contracts, Robinson. Then add a paper clause. He looked back at his screen. I'll still read the contract. She made a sound, not a laugh. More like the involuntary sound a person makes when something earns a response they haven't fully decided to give. She walked away, but she was not displeased. He had learned over 3 weeks. He had learned over 3 weeks and then over this new and different version of working for her to read the difference between the displeasure she showed and the kind that was actually present, and what was present now was something else. Something that had no name in the professional vocabulary he'd been using his whole career. Thursday of the second week, Timothy Clark came back. He came in at 8:40 kindness. He came in at 8:45, which was early but not ostentatiously early, with a coffee in one hand and a messenger bag over one shoulder, and the specific posture of a person re-entering a place with complicated associations, and trying to do it without drama. Ryan was already at his desk. He watched Timothy walk in. Their eyes met across the floor and Timothy raised his chin once, which in the language of men who don't discuss their feelings out loud means, I see you. I know what you did. We don't have to talk about it. Ryan nodded back. Same language, same dictionary. Rebecca's was in her office. She came out at 9, which was later than her usual 7 arrival walk, and Ryan understood the timing was deliberate. She came out and she walked to Timothy's desk, which was occupied again with his things. The same desk, at his specific request, because he'd wanted the continuity of the same physical space, even though what had happened there had not been comfortable, and she stood at the edge of his workspace and said his name. He looked up. She said, "I'm glad you came back." She said it without preamble and without the business register inflection she used when she was being precise about something. She said it the way you say something you mean when you have decided that the armor is, for this specific moment, beside the point. "I'm going to need you to tell me when I'm getting it wrong." That's not a suggestion. Timothy looked at her for a moment. Then, does that apply to everyone or just me? Rebecca said everyone. But I'm starting with you because you're the one I owe it to. Timothy thought about this. Then, my son's name is Marcus. A pause. Something moved through Rebecca's expression that she did not fully suppress, which was itself unusual enough that Ryan noticed it across the floor. She said, "Congratulations." She said it like she meant it. "How old? 18 days. Is he sleeping?" "Absolutely not." "Good. It means he's healthy." She tilted her head slightly. "Take Friday. Full pay." Timothy said, "I just got back. The accounts will be here Monday." "Your son will not be 18 days old on Monday." She walked back toward her office. "Consider it a benefit. I'm adding it to the handbook." Ryan watched her go. "Would you treat them with kindness?" He had been watching her for 2 weeks now, with the specific attention of a person who is trying to understand something they thought they understood and has realized they were working from an incomplete model. She had not transformed. That was the thing he kept coming back to. The thing that kept the situation from being a fairy tale, which it was emphatically not. She was still demanding, still difficult, still the kind of person who rewrote contract terms overnight and expected you to have read them before morning. But there was something she was doing now that she had not been doing before, something that had no good single-word description. She was paying attention to a different set of things. The Midwest project closed 3 weeks after he signed the contract, on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky above Seattle had done something unusual and actually let the sun through, the October light, cutting sideways through the office windows and making the screens slightly hard to read, and nobody particularly minding. Ryan presented the Q1 projections to the client himself, with Rebecca in the room but seated to the side rather than at the table, which was a choice he understood she had made, and which changed the dynamic of the room in ways that were subtle and effective simultaneously. The client, you treat them with kindness? The client was a supply chain director from a mid-market transport company in Columbus, who had come out to Seattle specifically for this meeting and who had done his homework because he asked about the week 11 through 14 gap that Ryan had anticipated and had the answer already built into the secondary contingency layer. When Ryan pulled up the second model and walked him through it, the client stopped him twice to ask questions, good questions, the kind that meant he understood the architecture and was testing it seriously. Both answers were in the model. Ryan gave them without looking at notes. After the client left, Rebecca sat in the meeting room for a minute after the others filed out. Ryan was gathering his materials. She said, "He almost pushed back on the week 12 numbers." "I know." He looked at the column twice. "You built the answer before he could formulate the question." Ryan put his folder in his bag. "That's the job." "No." She was looking at the window, the sideways light. "That's the job done well." "There's a difference. Most people do the job. Some people do the job done well." A pause. "It's rarer than I've been treating it." He stopped moving, looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was still looking at the window, at the particular Seattle light that came through rarely enough to feel like a statement. He said, "Have you eaten lunch?" She looked at him then. "It's 2:15, he said. The client took the morning. "You skipped the cafeteria." A pause. "I'm aware of whether I've eaten." "Are you?" Another pause. Longer. "There's a sandwich place 2 blocks east that doesn't require a reservation or a standing order. I know the one." He picked up his bag. "I'll get my coat." They walked 2 blocks east in the post-October Seattle air, which had gone cold in the way Seattle went cold. Not dramatically, but with a kind of settled intention. The cold of a place that has made its decision about the season and isn't going to negotiate. The sandwich place was exactly what it presented itself as. Counter service, laminated menu on the wall, 3 tables by the window, and a row of stools along the back. Ryan had been coming here since his 2nd week at Meridian, before it was anything other than Meridian. He knew the menu by memory. Rebecca stood at the counter and looked at the laminated menu with the same attention she gave to balance sheets. Fully, without rushing. Ryan ordered his usual, the turkey club with the extra pickles, and waited. She ordered the same thing, then looked at him sideways. What? Nothing. You have an expression. I don't have an expression. You have the expression you have when you're not going to say something but you've already said it internally. He looked at the counter. The turkey club is the right choice. The other options aren't as good. You're saying I made the correct decision. I'm saying the menu supports it. She said nothing. Would you treat them with kindness? But the corner of her mouth did the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency in the past 2 weeks, the small movement that was the beginning of something she hadn't yet decided to finish. They took the 2 stools at the back. The place was half full, with the post-lunch crowd, the people who ate late because their mornings had run over, which Ryan understood because his mornings always ran over too. The sandwiches came quickly. They ate in a silence that was, he noticed, not uncomfortable, which was itself a data point. Comfortable silence with Rebecca Sanchez was not a thing he had expected to ever be able to accurately describe. She said, Emma retook her midterm. He looked at her. How do you know that? She texted me. A pause. She wanted to tell someone who wasn't you. He put down his sandwich. She texted you. Tuesday. She said she passed with the highest score in the section. Rebecca took a bite of her sandwich. Completely composed. She also said, Professor Hensley acknowledged in the retake session that the original assessment format had a structural flaw that the entire cohort struggled with, which she felt vindicated by. Ryan stared at her. Emma texted you about her midterm. And about the professor. Yes. On your cell phone. We've established that she has my number. Because of the framing specifications. She had very detailed thoughts about the border width. Rebecca looked at her sandwich. She also said your apartment needed a better coffee maker and asked if I knew of any that didn't require a standing order. He sat with this. The image of Emma, in the kitchen, on her phone, texting the woman who ran his company about espresso equipment and exam scores, and the specific grievance of Professor Hensley's assessment methodology, the absolute, complete, unself-conscious audacity of his 19-year-old daughter. She likes you, he said. Which is, he stopped. Concerning, Rebecca offered. I was going to say surprising. She told me it was concerning. She took another bite. She said, and I'm quoting directly, I like you in a way that's probably not good for my objectivity, so you should know that going in. Ryan picked up his sandwich. Put it down again. She said that. She's very direct. She gets that from her mother. Something shifted. He hadn't meant to say it. Or he had, somewhere below the level of intention, in the place where things become sayable, before you've decided to say them. Emma's mother had been out of the picture since Emma was 11. And the reasons were complicated and the feelings about the reasons were more complicated, and he had not, in the context of anything related to this job or this building or this woman, said anything about any of it. Would you treat them with kindness? Rebecca didn't respond immediately. She was looking at the window, at the street outside, at the particular movement of a Seattle afternoon. When she spoke, it was measured in the way she measured things she was being careful with. Emma told me she doesn't hear from her. No. He looked at the counter. She checks the email she still has for her. Sometimes. Emma told me this about a year ago, which meant she'd been doing it for a while before telling me. A pause. She said she doesn't expect a response. She just wants to have sent the thing. Rebecca was quiet. She sent one on her first day of college. Told her about the campus. The professor she liked. The coffee in the student center that she said tasted like an argument with a vending machine. He found the edge of a smile at this. She said she didn't know if it was going to anyone, but she wrote it like it was. Rebecca said, that's an extraordinary thing to do. She's an extraordinary person. Would you treat them with kindness? He said it without any of the self-consciousness that sometimes came with saying things like this, because it was simply true, and because sitting in a sandwich place, 2 blocks from his office with a woman who had driven to a parking lot in the rain, he had lost the specific kind of pride that required him to understate things. She came out of a pretty hard situation, and she's building something. She doesn't make a big thing of it. She just does it. You did that, Rebecca said. Not as flattery, as an observation. I was there. She built it. He paused. There's a difference. That's your line, by the way. She looked at him. The corner of her mouth moved. Don't use my lines against me. I'm adding it to the handbook. She looked back at her sandwich, and she laughed. A real one. Small, and surprised by itself, but genuine in the way that genuine things don't try to be, which was how you could tell the real ones from the performed ones. It lasted about 2 seconds. 2 seconds, and then it was gone, and she was back to herself, except that she was back to the version of herself he'd been working alongside for 2 weeks, which was a version that had room for this kind of thing to pass through it. He did not say anything with kindness. Does anything about the laugh. He picked up his sandwich, and they finished eating and split the check because she reached for her card at the same time he did. And he had learned that there were things worth contesting with her, and this was not one of them. Walking back, she said, the Q2 projections are going to need a supply chain audit before the modeling phase. The Detroit hub data is inconsistent. I know. I flagged it last week. I saw your flag. I want you to run the audit personally. That's 3 weeks of field work. I know. He looked at her sideways. I'm not traveling for 3 weeks. I'm not asking you to travel for 3 weeks. She walked with her hands in the pockets of her jacket, which he hadn't seen her do before, the small informality of it. I'm asking you to coordinate the audit remotely with the regional teams and go on-site twice, a week each, spaced out. A pause. You can build the schedule around Emma's exam dates. He stopped walking. She walked another 2 steps before she realized he'd stopped, and she turned back, and she looked at him with the expression she wore when she'd said something she was assessing the reception of. He said, "You know her exam schedule? She sent it to me." She sent you her. She said it would be relevant context for project planning. Rebecca looked at him with something that was fighting a losing battle against amusement. She also sent me her study schedule and a note that said, and I'm quoting, "Feel free to reference this when you're tempted to keep my father past 5. Ryan stood on the sidewalk 2 blocks from his office in the October air and looked at this woman who had put his building back together with his daughter's exam schedule, and thought about the specific incandescent nerve of Emma Robinson, 19 years old, texting his CEO's personal phone number to send logistical constraints about her father's availability. "I'm going to have a conversation with her about professional boundaries," he said. "Please don't." Rebecca turned and resumed walking. "She's the most effective project management tool I've acquired this quarter." He caught up. "Would you treat them with kindness?" They walked the last block in the comfortable silence, which was still comfortable, which was still a data point he was still getting used to. Would you treat them with kindness? When they reached the building, she held the door because she got there first, which was a thing she did in general. Held doors, not as a performance of courtesy, but because she moved efficiently and doors were in her path. Would you treat them with kindness? He thanked her and she nodded, and they went up in the elevator in a silence that had the particular quality of a silence at the end of something rather than in the middle of it. The next 3 weeks built slowly and without the dramatic architecture of the weeks before them. Which was the point. The drama of before had been the symptom. This was the condition it had been pointing to, the ordinary sustained difficulty of work that mattered, managed by people who were allowed to also be people. Timothy settled back in. He was different than with kindness. He was different than he'd been before, quieter in some register and more direct in another. Like a person who had learned something about the cost of not speaking and had decided the cost wasn't worth paying again. He brought pictures of Marcus to put on his desk, which he did on his second day back, one photograph, set next to his monitor with the straightforward dignity of someone who has decided this is the thing they're done not doing. Nobody commented. Rebecca walked past on her morning round and glanced at it and said, "Good-looking kid," without breaking stride, which Ryan suspected was the warmest thing she knew how to do with this kind of information. Emma took her retake midterm and passed at the top of her section. Fine, with kindness. Ryan found out from her first, at dinner on a Tuesday, when she came home with the specific energy of a person who has resolved something they were uncertain about and found out they were more capable than they'd feared. She told him the score. and then immediately said it wasn't a big deal, and immediately contradicted this by describing Professor Hensley's expression when he handed her the results, which she described as the face of a man confronting information he wasn't prepared for. And Ryan listened to all of it and ate his dinner and did not look at his phone once and felt something in his chest that had the specific texture of a thing being set right. Sharon came over on Thursday with her nursing program person, whose name was Brandon, and who turned out to be exactly as good-natured as his 17 texts in 3 days had suggested, which meant either he'd grown into it or Emma's metric for unhinged communication had recalibrated. Ryan met him in the kitchen while looking for coffee filters and shook his hand and asked 2 questions about his nursing program and decided within about 4 minutes that he was fine. He told Emma this afterward, and she said she already knew, and Ryan said that he understood, but he was still her father. Would you treat them with kindness? And Emma said yes, and also to stop buying the warehouse coffee because she'd done research on machines that didn't require standing orders and had sent the link to someone who might be useful. Ryan looked at the text chain on her phone when she showed him the link. She'd sent it to Rebecca on a Thursday at 6:47 p.m. Rebecca had responded within 3 minutes with a single sentence, "I'll have one delivered to the building next week." And then, after a pause of about 40 seconds, "And one for your apartment. Don't argue." There was no reply from Emma to this, which meant she hadn't argued, which was the most surprising thing Ryan had seen in 2 months. The new coffee maker appeared in the office break room on a Monday, which was the kind of thing that could have gone unnoticed, but didn't, because it was a significantly nicer piece of equipment than anything Meridian had owned before, and because Rebecca had placed a typed index card on it that said simply, "This is now a standard resource. Use it." Nobody knew exactly what to do with this information, which was also the case with most of Rebecca's decisions, and they did what they always did with those, which was to process it and then get on with their day. An identical one arrived at Ryan's apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a service that required a signature. Emma signed for it. She texted Ryan a photograph of the unboxed machine sitting on their kitchen counter with the message, "The standing order woman strikes again." Ryan showed this to nobody and saved the photograph. The evening before the first on-site audit trip, Ryan was in the apartment packing a bag for the week in Detroit. Emma was at the kitchen table with her laptop and her notes for the following week's classes, the specific kind of studying that she did when she was anxious about material, very organized and very focused, and occasionally talking to herself about it in a low voice. Ryan had always found this comforting. The sound of her working at something she cared about, even when the working was worried, was one of the sounds he most associated with the apartment being what it was. He said, "Sharon's going to check in." "Emma, I'm 19. Ryan, you'll forget to eat if someone doesn't check." "Emma, I won't forget to eat." "Ryan, you forgot to eat last Wednesday." "Emma, I was in a study session." "Ryan, you forgot to eat during the study session." Emma looked up from her laptop. "I will eat. Sharon will check in. Brandon will probably also check in, because he's inexplicably invested in whether I eat, which is either sweet or excessive, and I haven't decided." She looked at him. "You're going to call twice a day." "Once. Twice. Don't negotiate." He folded a shirt. "Twice. And you're going to eat actual food in Detroit, not just the Hotel Continental breakfast. The Hotel Continental breakfast is food. It is not food. It is the suggestion of food in a convenient location." She went back to her laptop. "I sent a list of restaurants near your hotel to Rebecca, and she said she'd make sure you had it." He stopped folding. "You sent a list of restaurants, with Yelp ratings and distance from the hotel." "Emma, you don't research restaurants. You'll eat the same sandwich twice a day for a week." "That's my right." "It's a civil rights issue," Emma said, completely seriously. "Your digestive system deserves representation." He looked at her across the kitchen. She was 20 now, as of the 3rd week of October, and he had missed her birthday dinner for exactly 17 minutes because of a call that ran over, and she had been completely fine about it, and he had not been, and they had eaten cake at 10:15, at night, and she had declared it an improvement on standard birthday dinner scheduling because the lighting at 10:15 was better. He had no idea how he'd produced this person. He had no idea what he'd done to deserve the specific texture of her. You texted my CEO about restaurant research. I prefer to think of her as a resource, Emma said, not looking up. She prefers to think of you as a project management tool. Emma looked up. She said that. More or less. Emma looked thoughtful. Then, that's the nicest thing she could have said. He went back to packing. She went back to studying. The coffee maker on the counter had the particular hum of a quality appliance, low and settled and reliable. Would you treat them with kindness? The rain on the window was doing what it did. The apartment was the temperature of a place where two people had lived long enough for the heat to know what they needed. He zipped the bag. Emma came over without being asked and put the list of Detroit restaurants in the front pocket, printed out on a half sheet from the printer she kept in her room. 12 places. Organized by cuisine type. He looked at the list. He did not say anything. She hugged him. Briefly, in the way she'd been hugging him since she was about 16, and had decided that the long hug was too much sentiment for regular occasions, and should be reserved for significant ones. He held it an extra 2 seconds and she let him. He flew to Detroit on a Tuesday morning. The audit was exactly as complex as he'd expected, and more interesting than he'd anticipated, because the inconsistency in the hub data turned out not to be a data entry problem but a structural workflow issue, that 3 different managers had identified independently, and none of them had been able to escalate because the escalation channel had been removed in an earlier restructure and never replaced. He found this by spending 2 days talking to the people on the floor, which was not how his predecessors had approached audits apparently. His predecessor had reviewed spreadsheets. He put the escalation problem in his preliminary report and flagged it as priority 1, which meant Rebecca read it within 2 hours of receiving it at 6 a.m. on a Thursday, which he knew because she called him. Not emailed. Called. Would you treat them with kindness? At 6:12 in the morning while he was eating the 3rd item on Emma's restaurant list, which was a diner with booths that had been there since 1987, and which served a breakfast that was, objectively, worth the 7-minute drive from the hotel. Her voice. The escalation channel has been closed for how long? 14 months. It was removed in a cost restructuring. Nobody replaced it. Why didn't it come up in the quarterly reviews? Because the people who needed to use it were the people presenting the quarterly reviews. They didn't know where to put the problem. He drank his coffee. They weren't hiding it. They just didn't have a channel. A pause. How many managers identified it independently? 3. There's probably a 4th. I haven't talked to the overnight lead yet. She was quiet. He ate a piece of toast. The diner was filling up. The morning regulars arriving in the particular sequence of regulars. The counter stools first and then the booths. Build the channel into the Q2 audit recommendations, she said. Formal. With a reporting structure. I already have. Another pause. Eat something. He looked at his plate. I am eating something. The continental breakfast at that hotel is not food. He put down his toast. Did Emma? She sent the list to my phone with a note that said, enforcement appreciated. He looked at the ceiling of the diner, at the water stains up there different from the ones on his apartment ceiling, a different city's version of the same imperfect ceiling. He thought about Emma at the kitchen table, building a spreadsheet of restaurants, sending it with a note that said enforcement appreciated, knowing absolutely that the note would be received in the specific spirit in which it was sent. He said, you don't have to do that. I know. A pause, she asked. She asks you for a lot of things. She asks clearly and with good reasoning, Rebecca said. Most people don't ask clearly. They hint. Or they don't ask at all and then resent the thing they didn't receive. A beat. She's not like that. He said no. She's not. She got that from somewhere. He looked out the diner window. Detroit Street. October morning. Different city, same season, same wantle quality of light. That Craig came from being somewhere in the northern tier of the country in autumn. The light that meant the year was in its serious phase. The part that didn't have time for softness. He said. She got it from herself. Rebecca said. The humble version. The accurate version. He picked up his coffee. She built it out of things that could have broken her and didn't. I was there for some of it. But she did the work. A pause. You were there for all of it. I was gone for 3 weeks, you came back. Essentially, Ryan, she said his name. The first name, not the last. She did this rarely. When she did, it felt like a different kind of statement. Not the professional register, but something that didn't have a professional name. Being there eventually, when it mattered, is not a small thing. Most people aren't there at all. They're there in attendance and nowhere else. A pause. Your daughter knows the difference. Would you treat them with kindness? He held the phone and looked at the street and did not say anything for a moment because he was managing something he hadn't expected. The specific thing that when a sentence lands in the place where you've been carrying a weight you didn't know had a name, he said. The overnight lead's name is Marcus. A pause. Seriously. I know. I thought about not mentioning it, but it seemed like something you'd want to know before you met him. I'm coming out next week for the second site visit. I know. I'll be prepared for the Marcus situation. He's 62 years old, and he's been running the overnight line here for 19 years. He's good at what he does. Most people are good at what they do when someone bothers to find out. He looked at his plate, at the toast, which was getting cold, at the list from Emma's pocket, which he'd set on the table next to the coffee cup so he'd remember to use it, at the window, and the street, and the October light coming through it. He said, I'll have the full preliminary report on your desk by Friday. Have it to me Thursday. I want to review it before the weekend. Then have your weekend. She was quiet for a second. I have a board call Saturday morning. That's not your weekend. That's your board call. Another pause. You're going to be very irritating in this role. That was the offer, he said. You made it. You signed it. I'm aware of what I signed. Then you knew what you were getting. The pause this time was different. Longer. The kind of pause that has texture to it, that contains something she hadn't decided yet whether to say. She said, I did. He ate his toast. She said she'd see him Thursday, which meant she was also coming Thursday, not just next week, which was a scheduling adjustment he noted and didn't comment on. They ended the call. He sat in the diner in Detroit and finished his breakfast and thought about the specific shape that the last 2 months had made, the outline of it, the thing it was turning out to be. Not a fairy tale. He had known that from the parking lot. From the moment she'd said, I have a very good company, and I have nothing else, in a voice that's had no shelter in it. You didn't say things in that voice and mean them as the setup to something comfortable. You said them as a fact that had become too heavy to hold without saying. He was building something in that building.
Building it alongside her.
Not for her. Would you treat them with kindness? That was the distinction, the one that made Thursday morning and the Q2 audit and the standing order for coffee machines and the restaurant list and all of it add up to something different from what it would have been 3 months ago. He was building it as himself, as a person who left at 5 and called Emma twice a day from hotel rooms and cut the crusts off sandwiches, for reasons that didn't require explanation. He flew back to Seattle on a Friday. Emma was at the apartment when he landed, which he hadn't asked her to be, and she had made dinner, which she was not a consistent cook but was occasionally an inspired one, and the inspired version was in effect on this particular Friday because she'd attempted a recipe she'd found online that she described as aspirationally within my skill set, which turned out to mean a pasta dish that required 3 separate pots, and a degree of multitasking that had apparently stressed her out significantly but had produced something genuinely good. He said it was good. She said obviously. He said it without the qualifier. She looked at him sideways and said, okay, fine, it was maybe better than okay. He said it was more than maybe. She said stop. He said the pasta was exceptional and she threw a dish towel at him, which he caught, which she also knew he would catch, which meant the throw was the point. They did the dishes together. She washed, he dried, same as always. She told him about the week, about Brandon and Sharon's apparent escalating entanglement, about a paper she was writing for her sociology class that she was finding unexpectedly interesting. Would you treat them with kindness? About a conversation she'd had with George White about potentially adjusting her course load to go slightly heavier in the spring, which she said carefully, in the way she said things she wanted his opinion on without wanting to seem like she was asking for it. He said, "What do you want to do?" She handed him a pot. "I want to take 4 classes instead of 3. There's a research methods seminar that only runs in spring and I won't get another chance at it until my junior year. Then take 4. It's more money." "I know. You don't have to." He dried the pot. "Take the 4 classes." She looked at him sideways. The look that checked whether he was saying it because he meant it, or saying it because he didn't want to have the conversation. He looked back. She read the look and turned back to the dishes. "Okay," she said. "Okay. You're sure? The contract I signed 3 weeks ago has different numbers than the one before it." "Yes, I'm sure." She handed him a glass. "She negotiated against herself, you know. The offer she made you." He looked at her. "How do you know what the offer was?" "I don't know the specific numbers, but I know she spent 2 days before Thursday getting advice from a compensation attorney, because she mentioned it to me when I asked her directly." He dried the glass and put it in the cabinet and looked at the cabinet for a moment. "You asked her directly. I wanted to know if she was going to be fair to you. And you felt that was an appropriate question to ask my employer. I felt that she would answer it honestly if I asked it directly, which she did." Emma handed him another glass. She said she'd had the standard offer package pulled. She'd had the standard offer package pulled and then recalibrated it to what she thought the role was worth without the standard package ceiling. She said the standard package would have been lower. A pause. She also said she didn't want you to be in a position where the money was the reason you stayed, because then the money would also have to be the reason you left, and she didn't want the leverage to be financial. He stood at the counter and looked at his daughter. Who had had this conversation? Who had asked these questions and received these answers, and held them until the right moment to relay them, which she had apparently decided was now, over dishes on a Friday? "She told you all of this. She told me she wanted you to stay because you chose to." Emma pulled the drain plug, dried her hands, which I thought was either very calculated or very genuine. "Your mother would say the same thing, apparently. Huh? Either way, you get the same outcome." She folded the dish towel over the oven handle. "I know. I'm the one who said it." He looked at her, at this person who had his nose and her mother's directness, and something that was entirely her own, built in the years between and after, in the spaces where things could have gone wrong, and mostly went right, because she had decided, with the quiet stubbornness that was her most fundamental quality, that right was the direction she was going. He said, "You're going to be formidable." She said, "I already am." He laughed. She looked satisfied. "Would you treat them with kindness?" She went to her room to finish the paper she was writing, and he sat at the kitchen table with the good coffee and the quiet and the laminated drawing, which had moved from the window to back to its hook beside the front door since he'd been in Detroit. "Would you treat them with kindness?" Luke rotated to where it was more visible, where it was the first thing you saw when you walked in and the last thing you saw when you left. He looked at it from the table, the house, the 2 figures, home. In the handwriting of a 12-year-old who had understood. Even then, that home was not a building but a category of people. He had not understood that when he was 12. He had not fully understood it when he was 32, and hiding her picture in a drawer. He understood it now, and the understanding was not comfortable exactly, not the comfort of something completed, but the steadier feeling of something accepted, the weight of it and the rightness of it together, inseparable. Monday morning, he left the apartment at 8. He drove to the building. He parked in the garage and took the elevator and walked onto the floor and sat down at his monitor and sat down at his desk and turned, and the drawing was there in its silver frame next to the screen, which it had been every day since Thursday 2 weeks ago, and it would be there tomorrow, and this was the shape of it now, the ordinary, sustained shape of a life that had found its configuration. At 8:59, Rebecca walked the floor. She came from her office end, moving at the pace she always moved, which was the pace of someone who had covered this ground many times and was covering it again, with the same attention she'd given it the first time. She passed his desk, glanced at the screen where the Detroit preliminary report was open, the one he'd finished Thursday, and sent at 4:47. glanced at the drawing, kept walking. At the end of the floor she turned back, which she did not usually do. She turned back and looked at him across the length of the office, across the space between them, across 34 desks, and the ambient sound of a morning beginning, and the gray October light, through the windows. He looked back. She nodded once, barely. The specific nod that in the language they had developed over the past 2 months, in the absence of a better vocabulary, meant, "I see you. I know what you built. We don't have to talk about it." He nodded back. Same language. Same dictionary. She went back to her office. He turned to his screen. He had work to do. He had Marcus on the overnight line in Detroit to call about the escalation channel. He had Q2 to build, and a second site visit to schedule around Emma's exam dates, and a standing order at a sandwich place 2 blocks east that he was considering establishing because the Turkey Club was, objectively, the correct choice and efficiency was efficiency. He had a 5 o'clock departure. He had a light over the stove to leave on. He opened the Detroit file. He started to work, and the morning did what it always did. It moved.